Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf lamed bet. This week's learning is sponsored by Benjamin Miller in honor of Tamar Miriam miraculously birthing SY. All OBGYNs should prescribe daf Yomi. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. We started our third parak. And as I mentioned yesterday, there's a lot of parallel between the second chapter and the third chapter. And maybe we'll have time to address it, not today. But we're going to start with this idea. They start off with the psulim. And you think when you get to the beginning of this Mishnah, we're on a new topic. Who's allowed to do which avodot? And, we're going to talk about shchita. We're going to talk about Kabbalah. And from there, in the Kabbalah, as we saw yesterday, shchita can be done by any of the following people, a zar, a non-Kohen, a woman, slaves, Canaanite slaves even, and Tmeim, impure people. Okay, that's the first part of the Mishnah. And then it's going to say, but if they accept the blood, right, they can't do that. Only the Kohen does the accepting of the blood and then beyond. Okay, even though the Mishnah doesn't say that, they take that as obvious. But that's not really the topic of the Mishnah. And the topic of the Mishnah, if you look at the first few chapters of Zevachim in the Mishnah, you see that all it's just a build up to Pigul. We didn't start with Pigul. We started with Lo Lishma, if you remember. But really, the whole Lo Lishma, I think, this is just my reading when I read through the first three chapters, is that the reason they brought up Lo Lishma was really to get to Pigul, because at a certain point we get to a crossover between the two, which is, well, if you did it Lo Lishma and it's disqualified, then it won't be Pigul, right? Because in order for Pigul to kick in, everything else has to be just so. So they wanted to get to everything else that has to be just so for Pigul. So they had to give you the background of what Lo Lishma is so that you'd understand that if it was disqualified because of Lo Lishma, then it's not going to be Pigul. That's a possible way to read these Mishnayot. And really the whole central issue is Pigul, and that becomes very clear in our Mishnah as well. Because what the Mishnah says here is, if any of these people slaughter the animal, since they're able to slaughter the animal and everything was done the way it was supposed to be, therefore, last words of yesterday, lefichach heim poslim b'machshava. And therefore, if they have an intention of a pigul intention, that they're going to eat it or, right, burn it outside the time or outside the place, then it's going to be pigul, okay, because everything else was done right. But going to the next sentence now, v'kulan shekiblu et hadam chutz lizmano v'chutz lemkomo, but all these people, the women, the slaves, the non-Kohanim, all these people, if, or a tamei, impure person, they accepted the blood with an intent that they were going to sprinkle the blood or burn or eat all those outside of its time or outside of its place. Okay, let's add the words here that they didn't add, but it's obvious. This is not pigul, because if it were pigul, what would it do? It would disqualify the entire sacrifice. This doesn't disqualify anything. Why not? Because it's as if it was not performed at all. That's a very fascinating concept. The wrong person does it, it's as if it wasn't done, and therefore, yeah, you can't fix the blood, okay? You're done. They accepted the blood, that blood is disqualified. That's for sure. But the sacrifice isn't disqualified, and therefore, im yesh dam nefesh, yachzor kasher v'yikabel. If there's more blood in the animal, now go find a kosher, a kasher person. Have a Kohen go and accept the blood. Okay? Because this isn't pigul. Pigul would disqualify the korban, but it's not pigul because even though they had a machshevet pigul, their action wasn't even a valid action. In order for pigul to kick in, everything else has to be in place. And not only is this wasn't in place, it was the wrong person, but that's as if it wasn't done at all. Okay? Now, what if kibel hakashel, which means actually everything was done well, Kohen accepted the blood, but then natan la pasul, then he gave it to someone pasul. Now, this is different because in the end, the pasul person isn't doing one of the avodot. In the previous case, the pasul person was collecting the blood. Then we had to dump the blood. There was nothing we could do with that blood. If we had more blood, we'd be able to. There's a range. There's the blood is disqualified that was accepted. There's the whole sacrifice is disqualified. That didn't happen. But the blood was definitely disqualified. In this case, if someone kosher accepted the blood and then gave it to someone who was disqualified, yachzir lakasher, you can just return it to the kosher person. How holding the blood doesn't disqualify it. Okay, if a non-Kohen holds the blood, that's not the problem. If a non-Kohen accepts the blood, holds the vessel while the blood is going in, or walks it to the altar. Now, walking to the altar is a little different because theoretically they could walk it to the altar and someone could just redo it. Okay. Whereas collecting the blood can't be redone. It was collected, it's done. But let's say sprinkle the blood. Of course, they can't sprinkle the blood. Okay, but that can't be fixed. But if they didn't do one of the main avodot, they just happened to hold it, then it can be just returned to a kosher Kohen. Right? We saw these cases before. Kibel biyamino v'natan l'smolo. Okay, there's going to be three cases here where we're going to explain how it can be fixed. Okay, like the previous. The previous was also fixing it, but that was a little bit different. That was, go back and start from the beginning. These we could just correct by now doing it the right way. Gemara is going to later on Daf Lamed say, why do we need all three cases? Kibel biyamino v'natan l'smolo yachzir liyamino. If the coin accepted it in his right hand, and then he put the vessel in his left hand, okay, after the Kabbalah, if the accepting of the blood was done with the left hand, that wouldn't work. But if you just hold it in your left hand temporarily, yachzir liyamino, just fix it by putting it back in the right hand. Kibel b'kli kodesh. We've talked about the kli kodesh, right? Sanctified vessels, like they call generally klei sharet. It was accepted in the right vessel, but natan l'klei chol, but then it was passed into a regular vessel. Yachzir l'klei kodesh, return it to the klei kodesh. Okay, so those are three ways you just very easily fix it by putting it back the way it was supposed to be done. Nishpach min hakli ala ritzpa. We learned this already before also. A lot of this Mishna was quoted previously. If it falls on the floor from the vessel, again, similar to the previous ones, it was collected in a vessel and then fell onto the floor, vasefo, and it was recollected, kasher, because again, the Kabbalah was done properly. So we can then recollect the blood and now just bring it to the altar. As opposed to what case did we see? If it goes straight from the animal onto the floor, then there's nothing you could do. The blood is disqualified. Nitano al gabei kevesh. This, we had a big contradiction between this and the Mishna in the previous chapter, where again, if you see, there's a lot of repetition between chapter 2 and 3, and this is a one that's very complicated because this is a repeat that actually contradicts. Okay, sometimes it's a repeat that doesn't exactly contradict. They work together, and it's just, why is this repeated? Here we have a Mishna that contradicts completely what it says in the parallel Mishna in chapter 2. I'll remind you of it, and then we'll talk about how the Gemara resolved it. Again, sometimes, right, there might be some sort of editing difference here, and maybe there's another version, right? It's hard to understand. This could be a different opinion, but the Gemara always tries to reconcile as much as they can, and they come up with a resolution, which we can talk about how good we think the resolution is. Nitano gabei kevesh shelo keneged hayesod natan nitanim lamata lamalan et nitanim lamalan lamatan et nitanim bifnim b'chutz ve'et nitanim b'chutz bifnim. Okay, these are all the possible cases. It's either this or that, even though it says end. It wasn't all these cases, obviously. If the blood wasn't brought to the place where we're supposed to go, remember, the blood has a particular place on the altar it needs to go. Either on the inner altar, and then it's on the top four corners. It's a very small altar. Or on the big altar outside. It depends on which korban. The big altar outside is where most of the blood was sprinkled. First of all, there's two sides of the altar that have a base, only two of the sides. The blood's supposed to go on there's a base underneath. And it's not supposed to go on the ramp. There's a big ramp that the Kohanim would use to walk up to the top of the altar. So if you put it on the ramp, now the ramp is part of the altar, but it's not right where the blood's supposed to go. Or you put it shelo keneged hayesod, not where there's a base underneath on those sides. If you put the ones that are supposed to go, there's a chut hasikra, this red line in the middle of the height of the altar, going horizontal line, that splits between the top and the bottom. And some bloods are supposed to be sprinkled on the top part and some on the bottom. So if you did the ones that were supposed to be on the bottom and you put them on top, or the top ones on the bottom, so you put them basically in the wrong place on the altar, or even on the wrong altar. You did the ones that were supposed to be inside, in the inner altar, you did it on the outer altar, or the reverse. Im yesh dama nefesh, if there's still more blood, yachzor hakasher v'yikabel. So we basically just do the whole thing over and have a kosher kohen do all the, right, take new blood and then bring it and redo it. That indicates that if you put the blood on any of those places, it's not valid. Now, the problem is, because that's why we have someone else take new blood, right? But if you remember the earlier Mishnah in chapter 2, we said it actually is accepted, the blood. Anywhere on the Mizbeach, it's accepted. So how do we resolve it? If you remember, we said, oh, this Mishnah, which now you see it in its context, you can see why they said that, is talking about a pasul person. Okay, and there's two reasons to give that where the pasul person did it, and then it's like earlier in our Mishnah, if a pasul person did it, it's as if it wasn't done, and therefore we just redo it from the beginning. Okay, that's the way to resolve this Mishnah, which fits in with the fact that the Mishnah was talking about psulim in general. It fits in with the word yachzor kasher v'yikabel. Otherwise, you should just say yachzor v'yikabel. But if it says yachzor kasher, it sounds like the first part was done by a pasul. So there's definitely basis for the Bavli's interpretation here of how to reconcile contradictions. But I'm going to leave it open, and by saying that maybe there's a different way to resolve it. Maybe that's not really what the Mishnah meant, and maybe, okay, so I'm leaving that open, but it is a reasonable resolution. Okay. So that was our Mishnah. Now we move on, and we want to go back to the beginning of the Mishnah. The first line, in fact, it said, Kol hapsulim sheshachatu shchitatan kshera. All the disqualified people who slaughtered, right? All these people who were generally disqualified from work in the temple. That's why they're called psulim. It's a little unfair to call them psulim when we say they're ksherim, but okay. But they're disqualified in general to do work in the temple, but they can do slaughtering. Now, look at the words carefully, though. It's worded, any psulim that slaughtered, okay, I'm just translating the English of the first word of the Mishnah, their shchita is valid. Now, that is worded in a way, as the Gemara says, di eved in lechatchila lo. That's a language that the Mishnah generally uses when it wants to say, you shouldn't really do this, but if it was done this way, it's valid. That's what it means. Okay? Meaning it'll be accepted. It's not ideal. You shouldn't do it that way. You shouldn't have women slaughtering. You shouldn't have slaves slaughtering. Okay? Sounds like you shouldn't really do it this way. Non-Kohanim, you shouldn't have. But if they did it, it's okay. But that's not true. Because that contradicts the reading of our Mishnah that seems like the reading that it's only valid post facto. V'shachat shchita b'zar kshera. Shashchita kshera b'zarim u'b'nashim u'b'abadim u'b'tmeim v'afilu b'kodesh kodesh. So this Braita starts off. In a minute, they're going to suggest maybe not, but it really does teach this. When it says v'shachat, what it means is, I'm going to read you in a second where this says it. Shchita can be with a zar, it's kshera. And why is that? With a non-kohen? Because shchita is kshera with zarim, nashim, avadim, tmeim. Any of these people can do shchita. Sounds like it's ideal. Okay? Now, before we continue in this Braita where they're going to say maybe it's not true, but then they're going to say it is true. Okay? We already have our contradiction. Our contradiction is, our Mishnah seems to say it's only post facto okay. This Braita seems to say ideal. Anyone can do shchita. Now, where did they get it from? So we're going to read the first few psukim of Vayikra, starting from verse 3. If you bring a korban olah, okay, bring it from Zachar Tamim Yakrivenu. Now, bring it el petach ol moed, to the entrance of ol moed, yakrivo to lirtzono lifnei Hashem. Okay, it says you should bring it there before God. So bring it to ol moed, which in our time means in the Beit HaMikdash, not our time, but in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, that means the Azara. Okay, bring it to the Azara before God. V'samach yado al rosh ha'olah, and then you do smicha. V'nirtza lo l'chaper alav, and your atonement will be accepted. Right, smicha is when you put your hands on it. V'shachat et ben ha'bakar lifnei Hashem, then you slaughter the animal. Again, this word lifnei Hashem appears before God. V'krivu b'nei Aharon ha'kohanim et hadam. Now, v'krivu et hadam, we learned, is Kabbalah. Now, notice, where do b'nei Aharon, the kohanim, come in? At Kabbalah. They're not mentioned before that. There was no mention of the sons of Aaron until that line. So then it said, right, and then v'zarku et hadam, etc. So comes the Braita and says, oh, we know Ela b'kohanim. Maybe shchita has to be done by kohanim. They say, well, amartam v'chi me'ayin bata. Well, where did this whole thing start from? Michlal shene'emar v'ata u'banecha itcha tishmuru et kunatchem l'chol dvar hamizbeach. Where did we start off saying kohanim have to do the avoda? Because it says, okay, there's a different pasuk they're quoting from Bamidbar Yudchet. You and your sons, itcha, right? Aaron and his sons, kohanim, will tishmuru et kunatchem l'chol dvar hamizbeach. You have to keep, observe your kihuna. You're in charge of all things relating to the altar. Now, yachol af b'shchita. So shchita theoretically has to do with the altar. Now, you're not putting the animal to slaughter on the altar, but you are getting the blood that you're going to bring to the altar. So you would have thought maybe also. Talmud Lamal, coming back to our pasuk, that's why it says, V'shachat ben abakar lefnei Hashem, v'krivu, they skip the most important words, b'nei Aharon hakohanim, okay, they say v'chule, which means read the next few words. Mi kabbalah va'elach mitzvat kuna. So what do you see here? As I said before, when did the b'nei Aharon kick in? Only at Kabbalah. So from there you learn, limed al shchita shekshera b'chol adam. So there's our question. We're done. That was a long braita. To get to, shchita is kshera. All these other people can do it. Ab initio. But our Mishna seems to say only post facto. So the Gemara says, hu adin da'afilu lechatchila nami. Really, even our Mishnah means lechatchila. Why did it use a language of post facto? Mishum de kabay lemitna tmeim de lechatchila lo. Because there's one case that ideally they shouldn't do it. Who's that? The tmeim. Why? Gzera shemi yeguba basal. What's the issue? Well, a tummy person can do it, but what did the Mishnah say? As long as they don't touch the animal. Well, it's not so easy to slaughter without touching the animal. So, tmeim, the rabbis made a gzera, you shouldn't do it if you're tamei because you might come to touch it. And therefore, tane sheshachatu. And that's why the Mishnah specifically said in the post facto language, because the tmeim ideally shouldn't, and therefore they just put them all in that language. Okay? Now, you're asking Gita a very good question, which is what the Gemara is going to deal with next. How is a tamei person coming into the temple to slaughter? Okay? A tamei person can't go into the Azara. So we're going to get there. So the Gemara is not going to get there because that's their next question, but they're going to get there through their next question. Their next question is, well, it's kind of your question. It's just worded a little differently. V'tamei di'evet shapir dame. Okay, a tamei person can post facto, it can be kosher. How can that possibly be? Ureminu, there's a contradiction from the following braita. Now we're going to go back to those psukim. That's why I read them well. V'samach v'shachat. Okay, now there's a lot of things learned from the fact that v'samach comes right next to v'shachat. Okay, they're in two separate psukim, but it's v'samach v'shachat, and there's even a vav connecting them. Which first thing we learn is techaf l'smicha shchita. The smicha has to be done right before the shchita, which kind of means they have to be in a similar place, okay? Because you can't have to start bringing the animal then from one place to another, so it has to happen kind of immediately. But anyway, they learned here a different thing between the two. V'samach v'shachat. Mas smicha b'tehorim, af shchita b'tehorim. So the Gemara says, the Braita says, that just like smicha has to be with only tahor people, which we don't know why they think that, also shchita has to be b'tehorim. So it's not yet your question, Gita. What they're saying here is smicha is done with tahor people, and just like smicha, also shchita, which sounds like shchita can't be done even post facto, because this is a drasha from the Torah, which will put it in a Torah level. We said the tamei can't do it because of a gzera d'Rabbanan. This says a tamei can't do it because of a drasha from the Torah, which the Gemara says, what do you mean, midrabanan? It's a drasha, midrabanan. In other words, the rabbis just connected it to a pasuk so that you remember it as a mnemonic, okay? Samach, shchat, smicha, we all know has to be Torim. Also, shchita. So now the Gemara says, wait, that doesn't make so much sense. Why? Because Mishna smicha, dichtiv lifnei Hashem, shchita nami aktiv lifnei Hashem. Now, here comes the obvious, and this is what Gita was pointing out. If you're tamei, you can't go into the temple. Now, how do we know you have to go into the temple to do smicha and shchita? Well, by smicha, it says lifnei Hashem. And by shchita, it says lifnei Hashem. Now, this is a little complicated, okay? Shachatet ben abakar lifnei Hashem, that's clear, okay? Which means the shchita has to happen in the Azara, which means, of course, a tamei person can't go into the Azara. There's no way. So, of course, it has to be inside. So, what they're basically saying is since smicha has to be inside, and that's obvious because it says lifnei Hashem. Now, the problem is, where does it say lifnei Hashem by smicha? I'm going to read you the pasuk. You find the words lifnei Hashem in this pasuk. V'samach yado al rosh ha'olav and yirtza lo lechaper alav. Okay, there's no lifnei Hashem in that pasuk. So where does it say lifnei Hashem? Rashi says, based on what I said before, the techef l'smicha shchita. As soon as you do smicha, you have to do shchita. Well, then if shchita has to be lifnei Hashem, obviously smicha has to be lifnei Hashem because you have to have it in the same place. But there's another in a midrash halacha. It says if you look at pasuk gimel, which is right before v'samach, it says v'nirtz yakrivo to lirtzo no lifnei Hashem v'samach. So the next word in the next pasuk is end samach. He did smicha. So the vav connects to the previous words, and the lifnei Hashem is the one that appears right before smicha, which also sounds reasonable. Either which way, they think that smicha, and that's what was difficult. We didn't understand how is it so obvious to them that smicha is betorim. Well, they say it must be obvious because smicha has to be lifnei Hashem. You can't be lifnei Hashem if you're right tamei. You can't be in the azara. Well, then shchita is the same thing. And now we get to the fact that shchita for sure is asur midoraita, and that contradicts everything we've been saying, right? For shchita, we just said a tamei person can do shchita, right? And then we said maybe not ab initio because the rabbis instituted, right? And that whole drasha we said was all just a rabbinic drasha. But how could you possibly say that? Smich has to be lifnei Hashem, shchita has to be lifnei Hashem also. To which they answer, here's the answer to your question, Efshar da'avid sakin aruka v'shach. You could theoretically have a really long knife, be outside, and still do the shchita lifnei Hashem. Okay, I'm not sure I recommend doing this, but theoretically it's possible. Okay, so if you have a really long knife, there's no way you're going to touch the animal. You're outside, the animal's inside, right? That's okay. They say, wait a minute. You can also put your hands in. It's not. My body didn't go into the mikdash. What's the problem? My body going into the mikdash. By the way, this pasuk, it's current. If you go into the mikdash when you're tamei, okay, it's in Bamidbar Yud Chet, pasuk Bamidbar, sorry, Yud Tet, pasuk Yud Gimel. Okay, here's our pasuk. This is going to be important for today. In the Para Aduma section, talks about when you become tamei mate. If you touch a dead body and you don't purify yourself and you go into the mikdash presumably at Mishkan Hashem Timei v'nichrata nefesh Yisrael. Okay, you desecrate the temple and you get karet for that. So now they say, well, you could at least just put your hands in. That should be fine. Okay, so now they're going to say, so if shchita you could do from outside, and therefore it's not so obvious. It wasn't obvious. Again, the whole problem is they said smicha. It's obvious. It's not obvious by shchita. Why is it not obvious by shchita if it also says Lifnei Hashem? Because you can put the knife in. Well, smicha also you can put your hands in. Here's the answer, which is going to lead us into a whole other sugya. This Braita must hold that coming into the temple with a little bit of your body, any part of your body, is as if you went into the temple. So putting your hands in doesn't work, but putting a knife in is fine. Okay? Got that? So now we have this concept that we learn now. Bi'ah b'miktzat is bi'ah. We're going to see there's a machloket about this. But this Braita holds that going in a little bit is like you went in completely, which is why smicha for sure can't be done by a tamei person. Shchita theoretically could be done because the shchita could be done with a long knife. However, the rabbis forbade it, and that's this drasha. Ma smicha b'torim af shchita b'torim. The rabbis forbade it, as we said before, because we're worried they might touch the meat. So we don't let a tamei person do shchita at all, even if theoretically, right, they're outside, because we're worried they might come in contact with the animal and touch it. So now that resolves our issue. So again, starting from the beginning, all the other people listed in the Mishna could ideally do shchita. Only the tamei should not do it ideally because it's rabbinic. You might have thought it was d'oraita from the drasha. No, because the drasha is only rabbinic, and that resolved our issue. And then we just got off on, I don't even understand the drasha. How do we start with smicha and learn from there? Theoretically, they both have the same problem, but no, they don't. Now, just to confuse things, Rav Chisda has a different version of this Braita. He has the opposite version of the Braita, that we start from shchita and move from there to smicha. And now we're going to have to read the whole Braita in the other version by asking similar questions, but from the other direction. You'll see in a minute. And I'll just say that the premise of Rav Chisda, or one of the differences between Rav Chisda and the previous Braita, the previous version that we brought, is that he thinks bi'ah b'miktzat is not bi'ah. But theoretically, you could put your hands in the temple without an issue. And that's why he's going to start saying, read his version, v'samach v'shachat, ma shchita b'tehorin, af smicha b'tehorin. Just like shchita has to be someone who's not impure. Now, this clearly contradicts what we saw before, because it sounds like shchita is completely, cannot be done by anyone who's tamei. Okay? And from there, we're going to learn to smicha. Smicha is the less obvious case. So now they're going to ask the question in the reverse. Ma'ishna shchita d'ktiv lifnei Hashem, turning out I'm a bet. Smichanami ktiv lifnei Hashem. Okay, pray. Just like shchita says lifnei Hashem, and we assume that's the reason why you can't do it in the temple. If since you have to go in to do shchita, that's why a tamei person can't do shchita. That's right. Just so you know, there's no real issue with a tamei person slaughtering. The problem is that the slaughtering has to happen in the Azaran. They can't go in. So smichanami ktiv lifnei Hashem. Also by smicha it says lifnei Hashem again. However you learn it. So they say no, because efshar dema'al yadeh v'samich. Now this is obvious. If he thinks and he says, well, for smicha you could just put your hands in and do smicha, and your body's not in, then that's fine. Now what does that obviously mean? He doesn't care if biyah b'miktzat. He doesn't think it's biyah. That's what I mentioned before. The premise of his drasha here, his version of the drasha, is that we don't care if you just put your hands in. That's fine. It's not, you're not going to get karet for that. And it's not even forbidden. You just can't bring your body in, but your hands, it's fine. So smicha you could do by just putting your hands in. So shchitanami, you know where this is going, right? If you could put your hands in, right, and do it. And that's why smicha wasn't so obvious that it was forbidden. But shchita, it was obvious it was forbidden. But shchita, nami, efshar david sakina rukav shachit. You could use a really long knife and slaughter it. So why is shchita so obvious that you can't do it with a tamei person? Hamane shimanatimnihi. Now we're going to say, and this is how Rav Chizkiah could say something that completely contradicts our Mishnah, because he holds by a different Tanaitic opinion. So to understand this Tanaitic opinion, and now we're going to bring in a new issue that we didn't see before. It has nothing to do with coming into the mikdash when you're impure. Okay, that's not the issue. It's a different issue. Ditanya. I mean, it's connected, you'll see. Okay, it is connected, but it's not what we thought. Titania. So first we're going to bring this bright time. We're going to first see the rabbi's opinion, and then we're going to see Shimon HaTimni. V'shachat ben bakar lifnei Hashem. Now notice in the pasuk of V'shachat, this is the one we've been looking at. It says it has to be before God, which means it has to be in the Azara. What has to be in the Azara? Well, according to what we thought before, obviously the person doesn't need to be, because we talked about putting the long knife and slaughtering it from outside. So what has to be there? The ben bakar, the animal, right? Notice the words. And you slaughter the ben bakar lifnei Hashem, meaning the act of slaughtering has to happen before God, meaning the animal has to be before God, but you could be outside the Azara. V'lo shochet lifnei Hashem. That's the Tanakh. The shochet doesn't need to be before Hashem, the slaughterer, just the animal. However, Shimon HaTimni Omer, and this is Rav Chisda. Rav Chisda holds by Shimon HaTimni, minayin shiu yadav shel shochet lifni min hanishchat. How do you know the hands of the shochet have to be inside? Talmud lamar v'shachat et ben bakar lifnei Hashem, shochet et ben bakar yeh lifnei Hashem. He says the shochet has to be before God, and therefore he holds the shochet has to be inside. You can't use this knife, stand outside, put the knife inside. No, the way he reads the pasuk is v'shachat, the one who shochet has to be before Hashem. So there's this big machloket about who has to be inside, just the animal or also the slaughterer. So therefore, Rav Chisda thinks if the slaughterer has to be inside, well, then the slaughterer can't be impure. So that's the one that's the more obvious. From there, they learn to smicha, which is less obvious because theoretically, again, in the end, it's not true. But theoretically, the somech could have put his hands inside, and that would have worked. Therefore, we need this drasha to tell you even smicha can't be done by someone who's impure, okay? Because it would have worked. So again, there's two debates between Rav Chisda and the earlier version of the Braita, which is right the two different versions of the Braita. But the real root of the debate is biyah b'miktzat considered biyah or not? Putting your hands in the temple, in the Azara, is that forbidden or not forbidden? Is that as if your whole body went in, or is it not? Now we're going to see the basis for saying the biyah b'miktzat shma biyah, and we're going to see it in Ula. Ula is going to hold. Amar Ula Amar Rish Lakish. Ula is going to say in the name of Rish Lakish. Tamei shechnis yado lifnim lokeh. Okay, if a tamei person put his hands inside, he gets lashes. Shenemal. How do we know this? Okay, so by putting your hands inside, you're going to get lashes for that. Why? Shenemal bechol kodesh lo tiga. Now they don't quote the second part. Often we have this where they don't quote the important part of the pasuk. Okay, because they think that you know all the pasukim by heart. There's no reason. So this pasuk is written by the yoledet, the woman who gives birth. And it says, Bechol kodesh lo tiga, she can't touch any sanctified items because she's impure. Now this is even, okay, this is all the time she's impure until, okay, not only does she become pure, but she has to bring her sacrifices at the end of it, right? The Yoledet has to bring sacrifices. Till she brings her sacrifice, she can't touch any sanctified items. Ve'ela mikdash lo tavo, and she can't come into the temple. Makish bi'a l'nigia. So now we have a pasuk which compares touching sanctified items to coming into the temple. So what do they say? Ma nigia b'miktzat shma nigia. If she touches it with the tip of her finger, right? She touches the sanctified item, which is, let's say, sacrificial meat, touches it with the tip of her finger, problem, right? She disqualifies it. So, and that's where we get biyah b'miktzat shma biyah. Okay? Therefore, when it says, and don't come into the temple, just like you can't touch with a teeny bit, you also can't walk in to the temple even a bit. Even your toe, even your finger, none of that can go into the temple. And that's the source for biyah b'miktzat shma biyah. Now again, we saw before it was a machloket. So here comes Rav Hoshaya with a difficulty to Ula. It says, what do you mean? We're going to see from here that biyah b'miktzat is not biyah. Rav Hoshaya le'ula. Now I'll just tell you what we're going to do, the structure here. He's going to bring a braita. We're going to have a parenthetical statement of Rabbi Yochanan about something said in the braita. And then we're going to go back to explaining how this is a difficulty. So it's going to be a little while till we get to the difficulty because we have to get through this side point they bring about Rabbi Yochanan before we get to the difficulty. But just so you know, don't get confused. Rabbi Yochanan is not adding something that we need for the difficulty. For some reason, they're just bringing it anyway, but it's not germane to our topic. Mitzora shachal shmini shelo liyot erev Pesach. Okay, you need a lot of background for this section. The first thing you need to know is that you're not, okay, it says in Bamidbar chapter 5, the beginning of the chapter, Vayishalchu min hamachaneh, you have to send out of the camp, kol tzarua, shchu min hamachaneh, kol tzarua v'chol zav v'chol tamei lanefesh. Okay, a tzarua, mitzora, a zav, and a tamei lanefesh have to be kept out of the camp. Okay, there's different rules about which camp. Okay, there's Machaneh Yisrael, the whole camp, like a Mitzorah, for example, has to be outside there. There's the Machaneh Leviyah, where the Levites lived, and then there's Machaneh Shechina, where the Ol Moed was. Now, what we're talking about in the Azara is the Machaneh Shechina. In the temple, there were parallels to that. Machaneh Yisrael was all of Jerusalem. Machaneh Leviyah was all of Har HaBayit, and Machaneh Shechina was the Azara. Okay? A Mitzorah is not allowed to go into any of them. Okay? However, once the Mitzorah goes through their purification process, then they can. Okay? What can't they do? They just can't go into the Azara until the 8th day when they brought their sacrifices. The problem with the Mitzorah, and this is an issue that's going to come up soon, we'll get there soon. The Mitzorah, though, has to do one thing that they're allowed to do. There's a special dispensation for a Mitzorah. If you remember, the Kohen has to put blood and oil on the ear and the finger and the toe. We talked about this when we talked about the right? The whole thing about the right. So their right foot, their right toe, their right finger, and their right ear. And they have to do it, the Kohen's in the Azara, and the Mitzorah is really kind of on the border there. Okay, the Mitzorah stands in Shar Nikanor, which is the gate that leads into the Azara, and puts his ear, puts his finger, puts his toe inside. Okay, now, either you say that's allowed because biyah b'miktzat is not biyah, and it's totally fine. Or you say it's allowed because he has a special heter. Okay, that's going to play a significant role here. There's two possible reasons why it's allowed. Okay, that maybe it's really not allowed in general, but we're going to allow it for here. But let's start with that was just a lot of background information you need, but now we're going to start with this case. We have a Mitzorah shachal shmini shelo liyot erev Pesach. Now, his 8th day, which is the day he's supposed to bring the sacrifices and do this blood on the ear and all that, comes out to Erev Pesach. V'ra'ah keri bo bayom v'taval, and he saw Keri that day and went to the mikvah. Now, Keri can't go into the camp either. Okay, so definitely can't go in the Azara. Amru chachamim, af al pi she'ein tvul yom achir nichnas, ze nichnas. Now, the Tvul Yom can't even go into the Machaneh Leviyah, can't even be in Har HaBayit. Now, what's the problem? If we don't allow this Mitzorah to finish the process, which he definitely has to be in the Har HaBayit, he has to be right on the border there, he has to be in Har HaBayit. If we can't let him do that process, then he won't be able to do the Korban Pesach. So now, in other words, if he was just a Mitzorah, he's fine, because he already went to the mikveh and he already had the Harav Shemesh, meaning the nighttime came, and he'd be fine. He can go into Harabait. He just can't go into the Azara, but he puts his ear in and he's fine for whatever reason. Okay? But now that he became a Baal Keri, he had a seminal emission. Now we're stuck because now he can't even go in Harabait. So what are we going to do? So they say, Chamru Chachamim, even though it's full Yom, a general full Yom, even though you went to the mikvah, what's the problem? You have to wait. You're not tahor until the sun sets. Well, better to do an aseh sheyesh bo karet. And it's better to do korban pesach. If you don't do korban pesach, you're going to get a karet, rather than the aseh she'ein bo karet. What's the aseh she'ein bo karet? The pasuk I read in Bamidbar. Vayishalchu min hamachaneh. Send out of the camp anyone who's a Baal Keri. He's included in these Tameim. Send out of the camp the Baal Keri, meaning he can't be in Harabayit. But there's no karet associated with that. So better, the aseh with karet will override the aseh she'ein bo karet. And therefore, forget about the aseh of a Baal Keri not coming to the Harabayit. Let him come to Harabayit so he can finish the Mitzorah process. Because what's the problem? If he doesn't do the blood on the ear and all that, then and bring his sacrifices, then he won't be able to eat the korban pesach tonight. Because remember, if you don't bring your sacrifices, the Mechusar Kippurim can't eat sacrificial meat. So they can't eat the meat. They won't be able to eat the korban pesach. They won't be able to do the mitzvah of korban pesach. So therefore, better to allow this. And remember, pesach sheni is only for tmei mate. This isn't a tamei mate. Now here's the side point. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Dvar Torah Filu Aseh Einbo. It's not even an Aseh Sheish Bo Karet that we're pushing off. It's just a Derabanan. Why? Shenema Vayamod Yoshafat Bekal Yehuda v'Yerushalayim bebeit Hashem lefnei Chatzera Chadasha. It's pasuk in Dvrei Yamim. Yoshafat standing in front of the new courtyard. What's the new courtyard? My Chatzera Chadasha. Amar Rabbi Yochanan shechidshu b'dvarim harbe. They made a lot of chidushim. What was that? Amru Tful Yom Al Yikanes Lamachaneh Levida. This person is a Baal Keri, but he is a Tful Yom, meaning he went to the mikvah. Now, theoretically, someone who went to the mikveh, even though you haven't completed your Tahara because you have to wait for the sunset, theoretically, they could actually go into the Machaneh Leviyah because they did go in the mikveh already. But the rabbis forbade it. So he's just pointing out that it's not even the aseh that has karet overrides the aseh that doesn't have karet. The aseh that has karet overrides this dirabanan thing. Okay? So that's the halacha. That's the braita. Now, why is there a difficulty here? Because that braita dealt with the issue of a Baal Keri going into the Machaneh Leviyah, into the Harabayit. But it didn't deal with the issue of this Tvul Yom going into the Azara. He has to put his ear in the Azara, right? Now, what did Ula hold? Ula held Biyah b'miktzad is Biyah. So that raises a huge problem here. Yamar Biyah b'miktzad shma Biyah. If you're going to say going in a little bit is like you went in, how can we let this Tvul Yom go into the temple? Right? We're basically allowing him to go into the Azara. How could you allow his fingers and his toes to go into the Azara and his ear? No way, no how. Right? That is a doraita. There's karet. Right? Now you're going to end up with two karet issues because going into the Azara is karet. It's actually a lo taseh of karet. You're not going to have an aseh that has karet override a lo taseh that has karet. So how do we allow this? To which Amarle mitunach. He says, exactly from what you're asking, from this topic, I'm going to show you the answer. Answer is Ula, Shani Mitzorah, ilvu hutar litzarato, hutar likuriyo. We have a special dispensation. This is what I said. Either you say the Mitzorah can do it anyway because Biyah b'miktzad is not Biyah, but that's not Ula's position. So what does he say? A Mitzorah in general, even though they're really not allowed to go into the Azara, it's forbidden, karet. But we allow, in this case, the Torah allowed it particularly. There's a special dispensation for a Mitzorah, that they can put their ear in, they can put their foot in, they can put their finger in. That's a special dispensation for a Mitzorah. Well, it's true this guy now became a Baal Keri, and he's a Tvul Yom, meaning he went to the mikvah but is waiting for Harav Shemesh, and he can't go into the Azara for that reason. But since he already has a special dispensation as a Mitzorah, we're going to just extend that and say, okay, who cares now that he's also a Baal Keri? He has this special dispensation. We're going to allow him to put his ear in, put his hand in, and do all that. Okay, that's his answer. And with this, we end this section. But we don't really end this section because the reason I want to say we end the section is we started with Ula. Biyah b'miktzad is Biyah. Rav Oshaya asked a difficulty from this Braita. How could the Mitzorah, who became a Baal Keri, how can we allow him? We understand why we allow him to go into the Har HaBayit, but how could we possibly allow part of his body to go inside? If you say Biyah b'miktzad is Biyah, it must be it's not. Otherwise, how could he be permitted? To which Ula answered, no, he was permitted because he's a Mitzorah. Mitzorah have a special permission. That's going to apply even to the Mitzorah who also became afterwards a Baal Keri. So Rav Yosef says, I could take this even farther, what Ula just said. Amar Rav Yosef, Kasever Ula, and what's going to happen is Abai is going to bring two difficulties to what Rav Yosef is saying. With one, the first difficulty, Abai is going to basically just modify what Rav Yosef said, and Rav Yosef is going to accept his modification. But then he's going to have a second question, and Rav is going to answer that question. So then that's going to end our daf. So Rav Yosef says, Ula must hold that in a parallel case, like Ruban Zavim v'na'asut me'emitim. Now, remember this halacha tuma hutra b'tzibur? Tuma is permitted if the majority of the people are tmeim. We're going to bring the korban pesach or any korban tzibur, even though the majority of the people are tmeim, right? If you're tamei, you can't bring the korban pesach. But if the majority of the people are tmeim, then the korban pesach is permitted to be brought. So comes Rav Yosef and says, let's take Ula to the next step and say that he would say the same thing in this case. If Rubam Zavim, now, this only applies, Tumah Hutra B'tzibur is only for Tmei Emet. So, if most of them are Zavim, which Tumah Hutra is not Hutra for Zavim, okay? The majority of the Jews are Zavim when it comes to Korban Pesach, and then Asu Tmei Emetim, and then they became Tmei Emet. Ho'il Vutru the Tumatam, Vutru the Zivatan. So we'll say the same thing as he said. Just like the Mitzorah was allowed to put his ear in, and then he became a Baal Keri, we permitted it for that, we'll permit it for this. He says, also here, if we permit, they became Zavim, but then they became Tmei Metim. So since we're going to allow the Korban Pesach to be brought because they're Tmei Metim, we'll let that override also the Zav, even though normally it doesn't, just like normally a Baal Keri wouldn't be able to put part of his body right inside because Biyah b'bitzad is Biyah. But we'll allow it because he's also a Mitzorah. So if they have also Zav, also Tmei Meit, we'll allow it. So Amar Abai, first question of Abai, Midami. Tuma Ishtarai, Ziva Lo Ishtarai. The order is different of what you just said. In our case, he was a Mitzorah first, then became a Baal Keri. So when the Mitzorah was permitted to put his ear in, that was from the beginning. So when he later became a Baal Keri and was now a Tful Yom Baal Keri, it was already permitted, so we'll allow it. But in this case, when Tumah Hutra B'tzibur, first they were Zavim, then they became Tmei Meitim. So the Tmei Meit is going to be Hutar, but he can't go and permit something that was pre-existing condition. It's like having a pre-existing condition. Can't override that. Amarle, so he says, right, Midami, Tuma Ishtarai, Ziva Lo Ishtarai, right? The Tuma was permitted in the second case, but the Zava couldn't be permitted. So Amarle, so Abai continues and says to him, Dilma Hachi Kamarar. Maybe what you really meant was the flip case. Maybe what you meant to say was Rubam were Tmei Metim and then Na'asu Zavim. And then that would be a much more relevant parallel. Since already from the beginning, when they were Tmei Metim, already Tumah was Hutra, when they became Zavim, right? Ho'il v'utru l'tumatam, v'utru l'zivatam. Then you could say those are comparable, to which Amar Le'in, Rav Yosef, if you remember, Rav Yosef was Abai's teacher. But often Abai corrects and questions Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef often says, yes, you're right. Not always, but in this case says, yes, you're right. That must be what I meant. But Abai continues the questions and says it's still not the same. Va'akate lo dami, mitzorah heterahu, ho'il v'ishtri, ishtri. Mitzorah is a heter. Because it's a heter is like something very strong. So once it was permitted for everything. But tuma dechuyehi. Now, there's a big machloket about tuma, and this is what we're going to start right now. We'll only get started today, which is, there's a machloket. When we say tuma hutra b'tzibur, is it hutra? Like, is it a real heter? Like, it's as if we erased it entirely. Okay, and it's as if the people aren't me'im anymore. Or is it dechuya, that we're putting the issue aside? Okay, there's all these nafkaminas, practical ramifications of this. We're not going to get into that now, but the main thing is, if something's dechuya, it's pushed off, but it's still there. It's not erased completely. So he says, tuma dechuyahi. Okay, that was his way of understanding tuma. It's dechuya, and yes, we had this in Psachim. We've taught this before. Laha idache, laha lo idache. So if tuma is just dechuya, so we'll push it off for the tuma made, but it's not strong enough to be able to override also the zav. So even if the ziva came before, after, right? It doesn't matter. When the tuma was dechuya, it was just pushed off. You can't just say, oh, some new thing came in, we'll have it also override that. But Rava answers this by saying, Amarle Rava ad Rava. I'll use the reverse logic on you. And here you see how you could just take logic and flip it. Ibcha mistaber, the opposite is true. Mitzora heterahu. It's a special dispensation for mitzora. It's a heter. Laha ishtere, laha lo ishtere. It was a dispensation for mitzoraim. There's never such a dispensation. And it's, if something's stronger, it's going to be actually harder to copy it to something else. So this is for mitzoraim, but this guy's also a bal keri. We can't allow it there. But chuma dechuyahi malicha dechuya malishtei dechuya. If we can do something that's a little bit less strong, what's the difference if we say it works on one thing or it works on two things, and we can just apply it if it's the same people and they were all tmei made and now they became zavim? Theoretically, we could just apply the same dechuya to both. So there you have one logic going one way, one going the other way. You can prove it either which way. Okay, so what we do today, we started with the psulim, who can do shchita, but they can't do kabbalah, and therefore, if they have a pigo machshava during shchita, it'll actually disqualify the korban. In kabbalah, it won't do anything because it's as if they didn't do it. As if nothing happened. You really can't use the blood anymore, but you could go get more blood if you still have more blood in the animal. Then we had all these cases that you could fix. It was put in the right hand later, right? As long as kabbalah wasn't done in the wrong way by the wrong person in the wrong way, wrong hand, wrong kli, still you could fix it, right? As long as the action wasn't done, but it was just in that for a period of time in between. Then we had all the cases nitanoga kevish, you put on the wrong part of the altar, you can just redo it. Okay, which we had to resolve with the other one, right? That already we did a while ago. Okay, then we have the issue of the Mishnah sounds like it's saying only post facto. It's okay, but it says actually in a Braita that all those people are kshirim completely to do it. Okay, Alana's shiur didn't go up. I noticed yesterday. It should go up today. Sorry for that, but Alana has a whole shiur on shchita and also Daf Shalahem, which was up already about shchita, and particularly both of them talking about women in shchita from different perspectives. Anyway, it's totally fine. And then we just said the ab initio was actually because of Tmeim. And then we said Tmeim should be a problem, even not, right? Even not Tmeim, right? Tmeim we said was actually a problem, and it's not going to be allowed ab initio, only post facto. And I say it shouldn't even be allowed post facto because look at this drasha, right? And then we say, oh, the drasha is only to Rabbanit, okay? So we're not going to really allow Tmeim to do it, but if they do it, it's still kasher because on a Torah level, it's not, even though we had a Torah drasha, we said the drasha was just rabbinic. And then we had two versions of the drasha, which got us all based on the topic of Bia B'miktzah. From there, we got to Bia B'miktzah, we got to Ula, and then the difficulty on Ula, and then Rav Yosef, who tries to take Ula one step farther, and Abaye doesn't like it, but first Abaye just, readapted, flipped the case, and then said, oh, okay, we could explain it that way. And the second one, Abaye says, no, but your logic is really wrong, because Hutra is not the same as Dechuya, to which Rava says, yeah, you're right, it's not the same, but actually Dechuya would be even easier, as opposed to Abaye, who thought it would be more difficult. And that's where we end today. We're going to get back to Tuma Dechuya at the beginning of tomorrow's daf. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.